I am humbled. I am thankful to Chairman Cummings for giving me the opportunity today to tell my truth.
I believe he told the truth.
That was Michael Cohen and House Oversight Committee Chairman Elijah Cummings after today's hearing. Returning to our broadcast tonight, Congresswoman Katie Hill, newly elected California Democrat on the Oversight Committee, who took part in the questioning of Michael Cohen today on Capitol Hill. And Congresswoman, we realize it's been a long day. Thank you very much for coming on tonight. Your questioning resulted in us knowing about 11 checks. What else were you driving at? What else were you trying there to establish?
Well, the biggest thing for me was trying to figure out whether the president committed a crime while he was in office, because everything else is really important for us to understand the character of the president. There have been a lot of guesses going on, or a lot of things that have led us in that direction about what kind of a person he's like, and the testimony was really critical. But ultimately, the crime while he's in office is the piece of information that we have to establish in order to kind of pursue any further action. So I really wanted to get to that. And I think the testimony that Mr. Cohen provided today and the checks, the copies of the checks, is absolutely vital and shows some very disturbing information for us.
I looked up at Fox News tonight during their 9 p.m. Eastern hour. One of their headlines on one segment was "Still No Collusion." Do you concur? Does it matter?
I honestly don't think it matters. First of all, that wasn't the subject of today's hearing. That is what's going to be discussed in large part tomorrow in the intelligence hearing. That's really not up for us to kind of be debating right now, because we were really trying to be careful about staying out of any investigation, out of the way of any investigation that's going on within the Mueller investigation. So, I think that the fact that they keep using this word of collusion and just continuing to harp on about that is, to me, it's trying to hide something else. And what we know from today is that there is very strong evidence that, of course, needs to be further backed up, but that suggests that the president of the United States committed a crime while serving in the Oval Office. And if that's not disturbing to our Republican friends across the aisle who are supposed to be staunch supporters of the Constitution and the utmost patriots, then I don't know what is.
Let me ask you a dual question. If you'd been handed another round, and I've yet to meet the member of Congress who would turn one down, what would you have asked, and who do you think you should next hear from?
So actually, that's a great question. The piece that I would have asked is directly to Mr. Cohen of who else do you think we need to hear from? And, we asked that in our individual segments, but I would have wanted to ask kind of more direct questions in that regard of, okay, your testimony is over for today, but if you were sitting on our side, who else would you be wanting to call up here for us to ask questions of, and where do you think we need to be going from here? I think that that's just a really important perspective for us to get, and I hope I have my ideas of who we need to be calling forward next, but I hope we have the opportunity to continue in that dialogue and help it inform our decisions of who we do bring forward as we continue.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.